Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We are moving on from the French Revolution if you're one of my students, and we're going to talk about a revolution that doesn't involve a bunch of war, and that is the Industrial Revolution. Today, we're going to be talking about how the Industrial Revolution began and why. So by the time we are done here, you should be able to describe the causes of industrialization. We'll be talking a little bit about each of these causes, the advances in agriculture and farming, new energy sources, and new methods of transportation that made trade and industry much easier to facilitate. You should be able to identify which industry was the first one that industrialized on a wide scale. Spoiler alert, that's the textile industry. You should be able to explain why Great Britain led the way in the Industrial Revolution. They were really the first country to industrialize, and the rest of Europe and the United States would eventually follow, not too far behind. Also, be able to identify what the Industrial Revolution actually is, define urbanization, and define all of those inventions, which I just noticed all start with S. That's interesting. So, what is the Industrial Revolution? It is a period marked by the mechanization of daily life. This is where things go from being powered largely by, muscle power to being powered by machines. It generally is defined as being from about 1760 to about 1870, and it is divided into two periods. The first Industrial Revolution, which is what we're primarily talking about in this unit, was 1760 to 1830. Then the second Industrial Revolution, with further technological advances, especially in transportation, comes later. It affects all areas. It affects transportation. It affects methods of producing goods. It affects agriculture. It affects almost everybody's daily life in a material way, in some way, shape, or form. And we'll talk about over the course of the unit how that actually manifests itself. The important thing also about the Industrial Revolution is it marks a major change in geography in all of these countries. It leads to urbanization because people are moving to the cities to work in the factories. Before the Industrial Revolution, nearly everybody worked and lived in small farming communities, and you begin to see big cities pop up as factories are built and people go to work in those. So, what caused the Industrial Revolution? The first big cause, ironically, is changes in farming. There was in the 1700s something called the Agricultural Revolution, which was a change in how farming was done. For many, many years, there was not a lot of thought put into farming. You put seeds in the ground, you hope they get water, and you hope they grow, and that was about that. Then people began to apply technology to agricultural production and look at ways to increase crop yield, for example, ways to get more food, and ways to do it quicker and more effectively and with less labor. So some examples of that are crop rotation, which is where you change which crops you plant in a given field in a given year, and occasionally you'll give a field a year off to give the soil a chance to replenish its nutrients. Because if you use soil for the same thing over and over again, what's going to happen is the soil will just be sucked dry of all its nutrients and will essentially just turn to dust. And people in the 1700s began to realize that that was a major problem, and they started implementing crop rotation to make that go away. There were also inventions such as the seed drill, which was invented by an Englishman named Jethro Tull. There's a picture of a seed drill down there at the bottom. It is something that is used to plant seeds at an even pace along a row. It allows for seeds to be planted in straighter rows, and it just makes that process much more efficient and much quicker than it would have been before. All this new technology led to more food, and as a result, there were more people because people weren't starving anymore, at least not in such large numbers. For example, in Great Britain, from the year 1700 to the year 1800, a 100-year period, the population almost doubled. England's population went from 5 million to 9 million in 1 century. The population of Europe almost doubled at large. Now, this is going to lead to farmers being out of work because things that they used to be needed for are now done by machines, and as a result, they are going to look elsewhere for work, and they move into cities to work in factories that are eventually springing up. So you see how agriculture leads to industrialization. There are also new sources of energy to power factories. At first, it was windmills and water mills. We've talked about windmills in this class several times if you're one of my students. Water mills, that's where you put your factory on a source of running water, and the water will turn a wheel that will in turn operate the machinery. What you began to be seen used in the early 1700s was coal, which led to the development of the steam engine. And there's a diagram there of how a steam engine works. You basically burn coal, which creates high pressure steam that goes into this machine and causes the piston to move and create energy. And that really revolutionized the way factories worked, and it made it possible to build factories away from sources of water, for example. You didn't have to be on a river to make a factory go. The steam engine invented, or at least improved a great deal by James Watt, which is why the watt is the unit of power, if you're familiar with scientific units. There were new transportation methods that were developed during this time. The steam locomotive, or the train, was invented in the early 1800s. The first major rail line was in England. It was opened in the year 1830. By about 1870, railroads just went all across the United States and England and continental Europe. There was also the steamboat, which was largely perfected by an American named Robert Fulton. The steamboat is important because it could travel against the current, and it could travel upstream. So, to use an American example, since the steamboat was American, if you were in New York City, you could then move goods up the Hudson River away from the ocean and against the current by water, which was something you could not do before. So this made movement of goods that were produced during industrialization much easier. Now, why Great Britain? Great Britain leads the way in industrialization. First of all, despite the fact that Great Britain is a fairly small country, it does have a lot of natural resources, plenty of coal to power new machines, and plenty of iron to build those machines in the first place. There's also a lot of economic prosperity, largely driven by their massive amounts of colonies overseas, the Americas and India, and also driven by slavery. There's a lot of production of goods in Great Britain and in their colonies. And so upper classes, people who were wealthy and had invested in business ventures wisely, had money that they could pump into businesses. And mass production of goods also made it possible for everyone, even the lower classes in some cases, to buy them, because if you have more of something, it's going to cost less. It's the whole supply and demand thing. And more people had jobs because of the industrialization, so they had money to buy goods. Britain was also a fairly stable country. It had a great overseas trade network going all over the world, and of course, as we've mentioned in this class before, a very strong navy which protected its shipping. So I mentioned that textiles was the first industry that really took off during the Industrial Revolution. Demand for textiles went up a lot in the early 1700s because they were getting textiles into England from India. And it started off as what's called a cottage industry, which was industry out of people's homes. And it started as something called the putting out system, where peasants would get yarn from merchants and they would spin it at their houses. They would get cotton and then spin it into yarn, I should say. And it was okay for a while, but it wasn't very efficient, and the system of producing this yarn out of cotton was really, really slow. And new machines came along that could produce yarn at a much faster rate. For example, the spinning jenny, which you see a picture of right there. You could spin huge amounts of yarn at one time, and that leads to the creation of the first factories for widespread textile production, because you don't need tiny little houses to do this when you've got these major factories that can do it. All right, that will do it for today. As always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers.